Welcome back to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. Joining me, as always, is Shayne Kubas, contributor for Still Curtain. Shayne, we just received a little bit of disappointing news just minutes before we started this live show, and that is, it sounds like sources tell the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that Matt Canada is going to return to the Steelers in 2023. I know that this is not the news that a lot of fans were hoping for. We were hopeful that Steelers would make that change, the change that you and I feel is kind of necessary to progress forward and get to this Super Bowl caliber team once more. But let's talk about Matt Canada as we open up the show today. Just a little bit ago, a few days ago, it was reported that the Steelers coaching decisions were on hold as Mike Tomlin was undergoing a personal matter. And so that brought us hope again, just for a little bit there to say, okay, maybe this is why Matt Canada isn't gone yet.
Yeah. And I think that's why this news is a little bit surprising, because I haven't heard any news about whether any other coaching decisions are still being made or if they're on hold or what's going on. I don't know if it was just that it was never going to happen with Canada and it's just been reported finally, out of Steelers camp or whatever it was. But to me, again, this just doesn't make a lot of sense for this to continue to be the coordinator for this team based on a number of things. One, the last season, his first season as offensive coordinator didn't really do anything spectacular at any point. I know that people were blaming Ben and the offensive line, and that's fine. And that's why I was okay with the idea at the time to bring him back just to see what he could do with a better roster around him, because we didn't really get a good look of what maybe he could do or wanted to do with Ben at quarterback with the lack of mobility. But then we got, Mitch Trubisky, really mobile guy. We got Kenny Pickett as rookie. He's a rookie, but he's mobile. He could do a lot of different things. And it just felt like he never did anything to get the offense moving or try different things that could maybe get things going. And, you could look at the last few games, the past, last 8 games, we went 7-1, and the offense was better, but it was still bad. And I think that's the problem here is just because you're better doesn't mean you're good. It just means you weren't as bad. And this offense was probably the worst in the NFL for the first 8 or 9 games of the season. So going from the worst to 20-ish isn't enough of an improvement for me to go, yeah, you know what, you deserve another year to see if you can bring it back and make it better. But it's just, it caps the ceiling of this team, I think, and we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But it really kind of makes the hope for next year a little bit not as bright, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's really hard to find a lot to be optimistic about right now, just because the offense, you're right, it was better, but the Steelers played a really easy schedule down the stretch. They went 4-0 against the NFC South, which it turned out to be a really bad division this year. And just played some easy games, which attributed to that. But even with that easy schedule, we're still talking about the 20th best offense over that stretch. And so it's not like they were remarkable. I mean, it still is not a big enough improvement. And so if we're looking at this 2-year sample now with Canada, it's very underwhelming. It's actually worse than it was with Randy Fichtner. And Fichtner's a guy that nobody even wants as a retread because he was so bad with the Steelers. And so, and I think where they've gotten the worst, Shayne, is in their passing concepts and their ability after the catch. And the Steelers were just terrible at that this year. I mean, I was just doing a little bit of research, and you just look at this, just this wild card round. It's so hard to watch a team like the San Francisco 49ers, to watch what Kyle Shanahan does, how he gets the defense flow in one direction, how he gets guys running across wide open across the middle of the field, and they're able to chew up so much ground after the catch. Now, I know that they've invested a lot in skill players like Deebo Samuel, and those guys are really, really good at what they do, but the Steelers aren't designing plays to go there. Their plays are designed to go to the sideline where the quarterback is protected, less chance of throwing an interception. But if we just look at that sample, like Deontay Johnson, 147 targets this year, was 7th in the NFL. And he only managed 235 yards after the catch all season long. And so if you look at the names around him on that list, it's remarkable how much they were double or triple what Johnson was able to do. And so one example is just this past week, this wild card weekend, Deebo Samuel had 111 yards after the catch. One game. That's half of Deontay's production for the entire season after the catch. It's part of a Deontay problem, but I think it's a bigger Matt Canada problem because we are engineered to throw outside the hashes to the sidelines in an effort to protect the quarterback and run the ball well. And I just don't agree with the game plan. I don't think it's sustainable. I don't think it's going to bring long-term success. And so a little bit disappointed in that decision. Can't say that it was completely unexpected. Like we said, I would have called it probably 70-30 if I had to put a percentage on it. I was a little bit hopeful after we heard that Tomlin was putting coaching decisions on hold, that maybe that was the reason why. But we've seen so many teams fire head coaches, offense coordinators, and defensive coordinators since Black Monday. And when we look at all these names on the list, it's like everybody's leaving except for Matt Canada, the guy that maybe deserves to have that job less than these other guys. Like, it wasn't surprised to see like Joe Lombardi lose his job with the Chargers. But again, we're talking about a playoff team. We've got playoff coordinators losing their jobs, and the Steelers, who fell short of the playoffs just by a little bit, but fell short. In Canada still has his job. It's going to be for this season. And I can't imagine it, Shane. I can't imagine it going on any longer than this unless he changes his style, because I just don't think that Steelers are going to have an offense that even finishes average because of the game plan that he's trying to execute. We had this week as well, while all the Matt Canada rumblings were going on, there's a lot of talk about Byron Leftwich. And while he hasn't officially been fired yet, the Pewter reported that that is soon in the works, or the Bucs at least have plans to move on from offensive coordinator Byron Leftwich. That is a name that has floated around the Steelers for a while now, and it was really easy to see why. It's not necessarily would have been my first choice, but he has the connections. I mean, this guy overlapped in 2008, 2010, 2012 with Mike Tomlin. And so we know how the Steelers love to hire coaches and players that they're very familiar with, sign players, hire coaches that they're very familiar with. And I think Byron Leftwich would fit right in with that philosophy.
Yeah, and as much as, like you said, he wouldn't necessarily be my first choice. He had a rough year in Tampa. I don't think he had nearly the success as just a play caller in general as he did when Arians was still part of that. And I do wonder how much of the play calling he truly did. I know Arians said that he called the plays, but it kind of feels like his flair was still thrown in there, and his ability to kind of make the right decisions or right calls at the right time was still a big part of why Brady and that offense was so good last year. But this year, I mean, there was a lot of tough things to deal with. The offensive line was completely destroyed. The running backs didn't play as well. Like, there was some stuff to say that maybe Leftwich wasn't the only problem there, but he still is an upgrade over Canada from a philosophy standpoint, at the very least. Like, even if his play calling wouldn't be fantastic, you can work with, as long as the concepts are there and you can give your guys the chance to make big plays. Because there's a lot of big plays that the Bucs missed this year, especially like Evans and Brady weren't on the same page for much of the year. And then the one game they were, he had like 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. Like, we don't have that potential. Like, there is nobody in this offense going for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns with Canada this game. It just isn't going to happen. It's not even designed to happen. And that's kind of part of the issue. And that's why, like, it's not just that he's not good. It's that he completely puts a cap on how good he possibly could be simply by the way he calls games. It'd be one thing if the guys weren't executing it all. It'd be one thing if we were missing big plays constantly and they were always there and we just couldn't hit them. He's not trying to create big plays. It has nothing to do with his scheme whatsoever. It's not even something he's considering doing most of the time. And when he does try to do it, it's almost in the worst position possible usually. And it's, again, I'm not excited whatsoever about seeing it. He would have to completely change his philosophy from top to bottom to have any chance of getting out of the top, me being better than maybe the top 20 offense in the NFL next year. And that's with improvement, with guys being added, all that stuff. Even if we do everything right in the offseason, it would take so much for them to be, again, in even average offense. And most teams, you can't say that their ceiling is maybe you can be average on offense with the amount of talent we're probably going to have.
Yeah, I know. And I agree with you completely, Shane. So let's talk about Matt Canada and his return here for a minute. I don't see the game plan changing, just like you probably don't see the game plan changing either. I think it's going to be more or less the same. And unfortunately, I don't think this is just Canada. I think it's also Tomlin, because Tomlin wants to try to win that style of football. He wants to play great defense. He wants to run the ball 38, 40 times a game and protect his quarterback by not putting him in tough situations. Now, I had a discussion with somebody else earlier today, even, and the issue with this type of game plan is you can be careful with the ball. Like, Kenny Pickett only had 1 interception since week 8. And so you can be careful with the football and still have a bad offense. It doesn't mean you're going to have a great offense just because you take care of the ball. And so if we look at the opposite end of the spectrum, look at a team like the Dallas Cowboys. Dak Prescott led the league in interceptions this year. Dallas's offense was number 1 in EPA, number 1 offense. And so you can overcome that. They finished with a strong record. They were very good at scoring the ball, 30 points a game. And so it doesn't matter sometimes if you have to take chances, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I don't feel like Canada does that enough. I don't feel like he allows a quarterback to do that enough. And so, and I've said it all year long, Shane, I think that Canada's game plan is he lives to get into third and manageable situations.
Yeah.
If he can do that and say, if I can get into 3rd and 4, 3rd and 5, I've got a chance to pick this up. Well, the problem with doing that is as you march your way down the field, if you get into 3rd down situation 4 or 5 times as you're progressing all the way down the field, chances are you're not going to pick one of those up. And we know that Tomlin's not aggressive enough to go for it on 4th down if they weren't able to. And so that drive results in a punt, and the maximum potential for your offense is just so limited. And so I know that Steelers took shots down the field this year. Kenny Pickett actually had quite a few throws past 20 yards, but it's about the quality of the targets, and it's about the route concepts, because if I'm just throwing a YOLO ball down the sideline on 3rd and 10, 3rd and 12, that really shouldn't count as the same as like Kyle Shanahan, where Brock Purdy is throwing to a wide open receiver on a deep post across the middle of the field. And so we have to weigh it collectively for what it is. And so I just don't think that it's going to be enough. I've expressed that many times. And like you said, I think the Steelers will add talent to that side of the football this year. They were one of the youngest offenses in the league, so I do give them a little bit of grace there. Rookie quarterback. Their best receiver was a 21-year-old, and they had a really young offensive line. So there's definitely room for improvement. It's just that I do think their offensive ceiling is going to be capped because of the style of play. And I think another really good example of that is we look at the Miami Dolphins from 2021 to 2022, when they had Tua. Obviously, when they had Skylar Thompson, things weren't going so well. But when they had Tua, he took a major step up with Mike McDaniel because he changed the style of offense. He allowed his guys to get in a position to run after the catch and make big plays for him to help his quarterback out. And obviously getting Tyreek was a huge part of that as well. But I think that the Steelers need to start making those steps. Okay. Instead of saying, how can I keep my head above water as a 9-8 football team and sneak into the playoffs? It should be, how can I beat Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, and maybe now even Trevor Lawrence in the playoffs? Because that's what it's going to come down to. You are going to have to go toe to toe with these elite NFL offenses, and you just don't have enough firepower in your playbook to do that right now. So I'm hoping for some changes next year. I hope that Canada maybe gives Pickett a little more free reign, but we'll see what happens there. Unfortunately, this news was a stinger to a lot of people today.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our next discussion topic. This one might be a little bit more fun, Shane, than talking about Matt Canada, because we've done that too much. We're going to break down every Steelers free agent this year, and there's a lot of them. So the Steelers have 22 free agents set to hit the market in 2023. Now, some of those are restricted free agents. The Steelers can bring them back pretty easily, but we're going to go right down through the list here. And Shane and I are going to make our predictions, whether they stay or whether they go. And we'll throw a discussion in there of each and why it makes sense for them to come back or maybe not. So Shane, let's go ahead and start right at the top of the list. We're going to kind of go money order here based on contract value. We're going to start with interior defender Larry Ogunjobi. As we all know, Ogunjobi signed with the Steelers just on a 1-year deal. He had a big deal with the Chicago Bears that fell through earlier in the offseason because he failed the physical with them. And so Ogunjobi came to the Steelers, reasonable contract, $8 million. And he was a quality football player. I would say that he was the second best interior defender, obviously not better than Hayward, but the next best of an otherwise pretty shaky group there. So Shane, how do you see that going with Ogunjobi when we consider the depth of the Steelers defensive line, knowing that that might be a position that they try to target in the NFL draft? Do you think he comes back to Pittsburgh in 2023?
I think this is mostly a money conversation, because if he's going to get 10 million plus from someone, which I think isn't out of the realm of possibility, just because he already had a big deal lined up with the Bears. He did have a quality season with us. It wasn't anything spectacular, but enough where a team that's really hurting for defensive line help, if they maybe strike out on some big name guys or they just want to add as much as they can, somebody could throw 10 million plus at him for 2 or 3 years. If that's the type of deals he's getting, then I don't think there's any chance he comes back. But I think if his market is pretty soft and he's not getting a ton of offers for money, they might want him back for a similar like 8 million-ish deal for another year. And I think that would be smart, just in case you can't maybe get an impact guy in the draft, or if you don't want to draft one super high, it would give you at least a baseline of starting caliber play, across from Hayward in this defense. So.
Yeah, I think so too. And a lot of that, you as you alluded to, is going to come down to money numbers. How are we looking here? Because he, like I said, he had that great big deal in place. 8 million is still a good chunk of change. Yeah. I'm looking at a spot rack right now. They have him projected at 3.4 million. That seems really low to me.
Yeah,
I have a feeling that he's going to get higher than that.
Yeah, I'd be
Um,
surprised if he gets anything that low, yeah.
I think so too, because especially if we look back in the previous year with the Cincinnati Bengals, he was very productive as an interior pass rusher. And I think that a lot of teams are going to find value in that. He kind of plays like that Javon Hargrave type role where he's more the interior penetrator rather than the stout run defender.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
can see the Steelers getting him back. And this one is tough. This one is tough because if we look at a guy like Chris Wormley, another guy that we can talk about here too, Wormley just had the ACL tear. He's not going to be ready to go. Probably won't be ready until later in the summer. And so that one seems like, I mean, the Steelers, that's probably going to be a mutual parting there. And then when he's healthy, he might come back and sign either with the Steelers or somebody else.
Right.
But that does leave them really thin on the defensive line because we look at Cameron Hayward, DeMarvin Leal. Who else do we have that we can count on? We're going to go through some of the other names who are also free agents here as well. Right now, Shane, what I would prefer to do is I would take the money, at least some of that money that I would spend towards Ogunjobi, and I'd love to throw that into like a Deron Payne. Get somebody who can be like a foundational player, 26 years old, a very stout defensive lineman, and pair him with Cameron Hayward in the latter part of his career until they find a more long-term option to go next to Payne when Hayward is then gone. I don't know if the Steelers will go that way. It's hard to tell at this point how they're going to spend their money in free agency. I can see them at least going out and getting somebody. But right now, just based on what he was able to do and the fact that Ogunjobi started for them, I would probably lean towards him coming back with the Steelers. It's just going to come down to money. So I think that one is, it's almost like a coin flip for me right now. It's really hard to tell. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about Mason Rudolph, Steelers' third string quarterback this year. They got an interesting decision here to make, Shane, because Rudolph is a free agent, but Mitch Trubisky is set to count $10 million against the salary cap this year. And so the question for the Steelers then becomes, do you keep Trubisky at that price tag, or do you cut him loose and try to sign Mason Rudolph? And the displacement level between the two, you should still get a substantial savings.
That's the question. I don't think it's really a question of whether Trubisky gets cut because he's going to be. There's no way you can justify paying a backup significantly, not only more than your starter. Granted, he's a rookie, so that contract is small, but you can't justify paying a guy $10 million to sit on the bench when you know he's going to sit on the bench. He needs cut. Now, whether Rudolph is the guy you bring back as the backup, that I think comes down to, is he even interested in that? Is there any interest in him around the league as a true backup? Like he's going to guarantee to be number 2 on the depth chart anywhere else? Because if that's available, I feel like he'll probably take that opportunity because he, whether it's right or not, does probably feel slighted by this team at this point, being the third quarterback and everything else. I think he'd prefer to go somewhere else where at least if he does have the chance to play, whether it's injury or whatever else, it's going to be with a different offense and a different team. But I don't hate the idea of bringing him back as a backup if he wants to come back, just because we already know what we have in him, right? Like we've seen enough of him to know that he's not going to be spectacular by any means, but no one is going to be in this offense anyway, unfortunately, at least next year. So I wouldn't hate bringing him back, but I think it's probably unlikely just because I don't think the interest will be there from him.
Yeah, and that's what it's going to come down to. I think the Steelers are going to weigh that. They're going to see what kind of path his career wants to head in, and they don't want, like I said, they don't want to keep hostages. And so if Mason Rudolph wants out, if he wants maybe one more crack at earning even just a stopgap starter job for a little bit in one of these teams who is maybe transitioning to their next quarterback or is about to draft one and can kind of use him as that stopgap player, then maybe he chooses to sign elsewhere, because there are going to be teams that will be interested in a player like Rudolph, who's still relatively young with starting experience, a pretty good X and O's guy. I think it is going to come down to that. I think we can both agree that Trubisky's gone, right? I mean, there's no way they bring him back at that price tag. And it'd be foolish to try to tack on any sort of voidable years or extend that deal in any way just to bring that number down for a backup quarterback who was much less than spectacular when he was called upon. I think the question does come down to, at that point, if you get rid of Trubisky, who are you bringing in? And I think, Shane, it would be a good idea for the Steelers to target maybe even a more experienced veteran, maybe like that Brian Hoyer type, someone who can come in here and really hold the clipboard, help Kenny Pickett out. We know that this person is not getting a chance unless Pickett gets another concussion or goes down with an injury. And if that's the case, a lot of times your season is lost anyway. And also, maybe there's a chance that they might want to go back to Josh Dobbs after seeing him a little bit with Tennessee. I don't know. He's kind of bounced around the league. Dobbs might get a chance somewhere else. And it's hard to say because if we look at the free agent list of quarterbacks, I mean, there's like 24 guys who could be viable backup options. There's Mike White and there's Cooper Rush, who may resign with Dallas.
Yeah.
But a bunch of names in that tier, at least, that you can get for a fraction of the price is Trubisky. And
For sure.
the Steelers will have a different primary backup next year. It just is whether or not that is Mason Rudolph or if that is somebody else. I'm going to go ahead right now and say that it will be somebody else, that Mason Rudolph will be leaving because he has had some of those opportunities slip through his fingers in Pittsburgh, despite going 5-4-1 and doing a fairly respectable job considering the circumstances in his first year with starting experience. So I think that he's probably going to want to look elsewhere. So I'll have Trubisky going somewhere else and the Steelers bringing in a different backup for Kenny Pickett next year. All right. This one is fairly easy. Devin Bush.
I think prior to the last like 4 or 5 games, I would have considered the idea they may bring him back on a small deal. But the way his season ended and him not playing any defensive snaps pretty much at all, especially the last 2 weeks of the season, he's gone. And I don't know what his future holds in the NFL. I don't know if he really has a future per se. I think the teams will probably bring him in as, visits, tryouts, see if he shows anything. But I doubt he gets any sort of significant deal of any kind, especially not anything more than maybe years, like a prove it, come in and see if you can win a job type of deal. And it's unfortunate. Again, we all know the history of him with the Steelers, of giving up a lot to go up and get him in the draft. And that's definitely hurts because we know that he's not coming back. But things just didn't work out for him as a player. And a lot of it, I think, could be his fault to a certain degree, especially his attitude in certain situations. But that injury, I think, is really what obviously derailed his career. And if it wasn't for that, we may be looking at a pretty sizable deal as a return for him too, honestly. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think that didn't affect him. I mean, he was inconsistent before that, but again, he was a very young rookie, as we're talking about a 20-year-old linebacker thrust into a starting role, but he made a lot more splash plays. He had 9 tackles for a loss during his rookie season, and he flew around a lot better than he has post-injury. And I don't know if that's trying to preserve his health since then, or he just didn't seem to play with that same mentality. Like I watched this guy a lot at Michigan and he would fly around the ball. Like he wasn't a guy that's going to intercept the ball a lot or make a lot of plays in the passing game. But he graded out well, and it was easy to see why, because he was so aggressive. And we just did not see that with him these last couple of years here since the ACL. Bush is gone. He's very much gone. And he subtly came out and said that already, that he's like, I've got a future in the NFL. So if it's not with the Steelers, then it's somewhere else. And over each of the last 2 games, Bush earned a grand total of 5 defensive snaps each. Yeah. I mean, he fell out of favor hard. And if he comes back with the Steelers, he's a backup, and he's not going to go for that. He's going to go somewhere, try to get a fresh new start, maybe sign a 1-year deal and try to expand his value if he can earn a starting role somewhere else. I don't know if he will. He might be able to off of reputation alone because the guy is 24 years old and he was the former 10th overall pick. So that can get you far. I mean, it's that former draft status. I feel like we underrate that sometime. People will throw that or they will throw out your sample of play out the window if it means that I can go get this guy who used to be a really good player. And the Steelers kind of did that a few years back with like Eric Ebron, 10th overall pick. Sure. And Ebron wasn't very good at that point. He had 1 good year with the Colts, and then he was pretty bad, and the Steelers signed him anyway to fairly decent money because of that former status. I think had something to do with it at least. And Artie Burns ended up getting another shot because of that as well. So I do think that he gets another shot. It's not coming with the Steelers. He's going to try to find somewhere else where he can go and maybe revive his career and make a little bit more money. Let's talk about Cameron Sutton, probably the best overall name on this list. Huge piece to the Steelers this year. And after watching him play in 2022, I really wish that they could have locked him up to a long-term extension last offseason. Now that price tag, I think, has doubled. So what do you see happening with him this year?
Not only will he be back, he has to be. Right, like the Steelers cannot allow him to come walk out the building because they do not have anyone else on the roster right now that they can confidently say can be a true corner 1 or corner 2 type of player. There just isn't anybody that they can say that about. And you hope that, Witherspoon on a small deal, maybe he can come back and play more like he did for us in 2021. You hope that, Wallace can continue to at least take the ball away and not be a complete liability. But you have to have somebody who you can confidently say, hey, I need somebody to cover the best receiver on the other team at least some of the game. I need somebody who can do that. Sutton did that for us this year and did it very well. So I'd be very surprised if he doesn't come back. I do wonder what the money is ultimately going to look like because again, he's not a old player by any means, but he's not super young
Mhm.
at this point. You're probably not going to get a huge deal in terms of years, but he could get 12, 13, 14 even million from some teams if he is able to field offers from other teams. And I think the Steelers' best interest is to sign him as soon as they possibly can, work that out as fast as they can. Don't let other teams kind of get in his head or try to throw some money at him because there's going to be teams that have money who need corner help and they might be willing to throw it at him just because he's a guy that hasn't made a ton of money in his career, hasn't had that big deal. I'm sure he'd love to have it, but I think he does want to come back to the Steelers though. So I'd be surprised if he doesn't.
Yeah, if you look at the free agent list this year, Shane, when it comes to cornerbacks, it's a bunch of old guys.
Yeah.
And there's Cam Sutton and there's Jamel Dean. And I feel like that might unfortunately drive the price up a little bit because right now Cam Sutton is 27.8 years old, which means he turns 28 early in the offseason. That's still younger than like the 7 or 8 other guys at the top of the list outside of Dean. Now, maybe if they went that direction and they said, I want to go big, let's sign a Jamel Dean to be our number 1 outside corner, or Bradbury, someone like that, that level, they could do that. It just doesn't seem like the Steelers' way. Giving up on a guy who is performing well for them. They're going to reward Sutton. They're going to do so handsomely. Sutton will be back. And I think that Sutton, I really think that he's one of the best nickel and dime corners in the NFL. When you get him playing in that role, especially when he's playing inside, I feel like that's when he's best. I think that when you play him on the outside, I think he's probably an above average corner, but not an elite football player. And so it's finding that balance. Like, I'll be interested to see what the market value ends up being for him. But the Steelers are going to have to pay pretty well. And I think that they will do it for a couple of reasons. They lost Mike Hilton a few years back, and they probably realized in hindsight, maybe they could have freed up some money to keep him around. And now they can't afford to lose another one of those guys because they don't have another option. Like Arthur Maulet is not a true option in that role behind him. So, and really, I think a lot of it comes down to depth because they just don't have cornerback depth on the team. Like outside of Sutton, there's not another guy you can trust. I think that Wallace is probably good as the team's 3rd corner. I like him best in that role. Witherspoon was injured all year. We'll see what they do with him. He is still under contract. That is a name they can potentially get out of to save $4+ million. But I think that they have to roll with the only cornerback they can trust on the roster right now, then maybe spend another draft pick on one, because I don't know if they'll be able to sign another big name in free agency if you're giving Sutton that money. But I do think that they keep him around. I agree with you. All right, next name on the list, fullback Derek Watt. We know how much the Steelers love these family bloodlines, Shane. Is it enough to keep him around going forward? Watt is 30 years old right now.
If they're going to have a fullback on the roster, it might as well be Derek. And he's still a good special teamer. They used him a little bit this year, actually, in the offense a couple times. Like, honestly, as long as they're not paying him significant amount of money, which I don't see why they would have to at this point in his career, go ahead, give him a 1-year deal or whatever to come back. He can be the fullback. We don't use it a lot anyway, but I know we're going to have one. So I'd rather it be Derek instead of have to mess around and, make TJ maybe a little irritated, which I don't even know if he would actually be upset about it. But point is, he'll be back just because of his name, if nothing else, but he also does what he does fine.
Yeah, I think Derek Watt is coming back as well. I agree with you. And I think that the Steelers can kind of look back at him and say, hey, we kind of threw you a little bone there. We made you like the 2nd highest paid fullback in the NFL back when we signed you. I don't think there's going to be a big market for a 30-year-old fullback who rarely plays offense. I mean, rarely plays offense. We're talking about strictly a special teams player. So he's probably close to like what Matakavich was when he left, but probably not even at that level of a special teams player. So I don't think the market is going to be insanely big for Derek Watt. I think that Watt is going to want to stick around. It's where his family is now. I'm sure he likes playing with his brother. There's something to be said about that. I don't care what anybody says. The fact that there are 3 brother pairings, or there were at least 3 brother pairings on the Steelers over these past 2 years, that means something. And Tomlin does value that as well. He wants to, he's a player's coach. He wants to keep these guys happy. and keep TJ Watt's your best player. And so why not keep him happy? And if they have to overpay a little bit for Derek Watt, they'll probably do it. I think he'll be able to come in pretty close to veteran minimum, maybe a little bit over that. And I don't see him going anywhere else really. I just think that there's not going to be much of a market for a 30-plus-year-old fullback, probably in the final few seasons of his NFL career. So I think that Watt's coming back as well. All right. Jesse Davis, a guy that we really didn't see this year at all, kind of the offensive tackle guard type player. One that was kind of a bizarre like trade right there before. What do you see happen with him? Former Dolphins player, had some starts, but was very disappointing in Miami.
Yeah, let's just say I'm pretty excited that we didn't have to say his name at all this year.
Yes.
Mostly because of health on the offensive line. We didn't really have any issues at all. Most of these guys played the majority of the year. Yeah, he can go. I don't think he really has any reason to be on this team. I mean, I feel like you can get a better swing tackle / guard by just either signing someone else or drafting somebody to put someone else on the bench, most likely Dan Moore, whatever the case may be. There's definitely better avenues to get depth on the offensive line than Jesse Davis. So I can just go ahead and say he won't be here.
Yeah, and on the few snaps that they did call upon an offensive tackle, it was Trent Scott, and he sometimes came on as like the extra offensive lineman. They don't need Jesse Davis at all. You don't need a 31-year-old tackle who, when he has started, has been a really poor player in the past. And especially when you consider the fact that the Steelers are very likely to draft an offensive tackle this year. I would say very
at some point. Yeah,
at some point. It might not be to replace Dan Moore. I would like it to be. I want them to address it early because it's an important position. But I mean, at the very least, I can see them drafting one. And at that point, Trent Scott's not even guaranteed to make the roster at that point. And now Davis kind of served as like the backup guard as well. Kendrick Green was rarely active, and the Steelers were very fortunate to have the health that they did on the offensive line this year. They were the healthiest offensive line in the league. So that helped them kind of mesh down the stretch there. But I wouldn't be surprised if they drafted 2 offensive linemen this year. Maybe one of them competes for a starting job and one is taken later in the draft, and a tackle and an interior guy. And so I just think that there's very little chance Jesse Davis comes back. I don't see the appeal there at all. If they are to go out and sign a tackle, I would hope it would be one who is more of a true tackle rather than a tweener type guy who struggles with speed. So I think that Jesse Davis is gone. Tyson Alualu, this guy has been good for the Steelers in the past, came over in 2017. And he was good back then, but man, we have not seen the same Alualu since then. So what happens, Shane?
I think he retires personally.
Yeah,
I think he's going to end up retiring, but if he doesn't, I think that it will be with someone else that he gets a shot. I mean, maybe a team that needs D-line depth will just give him a shot, but I don't think he returns to Steelers. He kind of fell out of favor for most of the year after he had a rough start to the year. And, maybe that is partly due to injury, but he is an older player. I think he's 36 or going to be 36. I forget. At this point, be 36. Yeah, he probably is better off just calling it a career. He had a very solid career after a really rough start to his career as, kind of more of a bust considered player, but really turned it on for us and had some good years. So I think at this point, probably best just to hang it up and be done with it.
Yeah, and I think if Alualu wasn't the 10th overall pick by the Jaguars, if he was like a second rounder, you'd be saying this guy's had an amazing long
really
NFL
good
career. And he really has, regardless of his draft position. And I think from 2017 to 2020, he was an outstanding player for the Steelers. Everything they could have asked for in that role, to pair with Cam Hayward and Stephon Tuitt, and to be that stout run defending player who can also provide some pressure on the quarterback. He was excellent in that role. Now, when he had that season-ending ankle injury in 2021, he just was not the same after that. And that's to be expected at the age of 35. He was pretty poor, got demoted early on in the season for Montravius Adams, never really saw a ton of snaps after that. And so I think that he hangs up the cleats. I can't see there being a market for an old player who's coming off of a very down year, and then the year prior was spent all year on IR. So I think that he does retire, but it was a nice career. He had a nice run with the Steelers. Let's talk about Marcus Allen. Biggest bonehead of the play of the year award goes to Marcus Allen. So we've seen a couple of those out of him. Where do you think Tomlin likes this guy apparently enough to stick him around year after year as a special teamer? Like, he's always on our roster bubble saying he's not a true linebacker, doesn't play a lot of defense, strictly just a special teams guy. But when you're that up back, you play a pretty important role. So what do you see happening with him?
I want to say that he'll be gone just because, again, he did have the bonehead moment of the year for sure. He just doesn't bring any value on defense. I guess he's a good special teamer, but nothing spectacular. He's definitely one of those players that changes teams every year normally, right? And, they stick around as a special teamer from year to
Mhm.
year, but he's probably going to be back just because, again, you alluded to it, like Tomlin likes him. He is a good special teamer. There's nothing wrong with him in that role. But I'd rather have someone else fill that back end of the roster role that has more of a potential to maybe be a player on defense, like Mark Robinson or whoever
Mhm.
else. And I worry that if you keep him around in any capacity, he's going to end up making the 53 over somebody who maybe is either younger or just has a better chance of breaking into the actual team at some point. So I'd rather him be
Yeah.
gone.
Which is exactly what we saw this year. The Steelers cut fourth-round pick Buddy Johnson without ever really giving him a look on the
Yeah.
defensive side of the ball, at least during the regular season, in favor of keeping Marcus Allen around. And you're right. I mean, until I see it happen, I'm not going to believe that Allen is going to be gone. That's kind of the
No.
approach that I'm going to take with him. Mike Tomlin likes him. Danny Smith likes him, and he plays that up back role for the Steelers. And so they view that as important enough to keep him around. And also, I think when you consider the linebacker depth and the fact that Bush is almost certainly gone, Miles
Yeah.
Jack could be gone for financial reasons. Robert Spillane is an unrestricted free agent who we're going to talk about here in a second. So I think the depth is already shaky enough. They're not going to want to lose one of their bottom pieces of that depth, who's also a core special teams player. I'm going to say that he sticks around for another season. Terrell Edmunds, one of the bigger names on this list. The Steelers were able to sign him back for like $2.5 million this last year. I think it was an outstanding deal. That price number projected to double according to Spot Rack. He's projected to be closer to $5.5 million range when he signs this offseason. Do you think that will be with the Steelers or with somebody else?
I certainly hope it's with the Steelers, and I'd be totally fine giving him like a 3-year, 16-ish, 17-ish million dollar contract without a hesitation whatsoever. He
Mhm.
works so well with Fitzpatrick at this point. He's really improved as a player. I know the people still kind of view him as a reach in the first round. He was, especially at that point in time, but he's become a player that's worthy, in my opinion, of that draft status, a late first round pick. He's played up to that level the past 2 years, and I don't want to mess with what we have at safety. And that does kind of allude to something else we'll talk about, another player we'll talk about in a little bit. But I really like the way, especially down the stretch of the season, once, another guy came back, how they meshed and how they were able to play together. I don't want to mess with that part of the defense. I think it's totally fine. There's definitely other parts of the defense that needs addressed, but safety isn't one of them. I definitely want to see Evans come back.
Yeah, and I've been saying for a while now, I really think there's something to be said with continuity, particularly at the safety position.
Yes.
Because when Minka's out there making plays, I don't want to say it's that Palomar Ryan Clark type thing, but those guys knew what each other were doing. And when you
Yes.
play together as long as what Edmonds and Fitzpatrick have, chances are it's probably only going to get better from there. They're going to be able to read what each other are doing. And Edmonds he just doesn't get injured. I mean, he's
No.
missed like 1 or 2 career games. And so he's been extremely healthy. We're finally starting to see the benefits of taking him early in the draft. I still think he probably should have been a second rounder. People would like him a lot more if he was.
Yes. Yes.
But he's really come around. And I think outside of maybe like a 4-game stretch where he kind of just was so this year, I think he was a pretty strong player overall, improved kind of his game overall. Now, unfortunately, Edmonds is never going to be that guy that's going to take the ball away a lot. And that's in
Probably
a
not.
safety
No.
position. It's important to have that. But if you can live with that, I think they can get him back on a reasonable deal. I kind of think that Edmonds is going to be that guy that kind of goes year to year contract. I don't know if the
Yeah,
Steelers would feel
probably.
comfortable enough locking him up to a long-term deal, especially if there's not a huge market for him out there. But I think unless the Steelers are willing to go out and get like a Donovan Wilson from the Cowboys or someone like that, who they might pay a little bit more for, I can definitely see Edmonds coming back. And I think it's the right decision to have him come back as well. Keep that continuity. I trust the safeties. When you have Fitzpatrick, Edmonds back there, I like what they have going for them. And I think that's a position that is solidified. And it's one that I don't want to have to spend a first or second round pick addressing either, because they already have 2 young guys. Edmonds isn't even 26 years old. He turns 26, I think, the end of this month. But he's still a young guy, good athletic traits, long, can tackle. And so I think that Steelers should keep him around. And I think that they probably will.
Mhm.
All right, Robert Spillane, a guy who ended up being leading the Steelers in snaps on at the linebacker position, because I guess just the other options they weren't thrilled with. And Miles Jack did he missed 2 games, but for some reason, I mean, Spillane's that guy. He's a Tomlin guy, and they like him in coverage. And so, what do you think they do with him this year?
Well, I have to assume he'll be back, and I assume it will be on a very small deal because no one else is going to even probably look his direction in free agency, at least not anybody with any interest in a starting linebacker. My concern, again, is just the fact that I think if he's re-signed, he's probably going to play 70, 80, 90% of the snaps in defense unless they find somebody who they think is actually good in coverage, because they may like Robert Spillane in coverage, but so does the other team. So, I'd rather that not be the case anymore. If they can bring somebody in as a true cover player, then I'm mostly fine with him being on the team. I just can't. You can't make any excuse for him playing as much as he did last year, even with as bad as the other linebackers were at times. He's not the answer either, but I feel like he's going to be part of the solution, if you want to, solution for the linebacker position next year, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, I think he's a guy. He really needs to go back to being just a role player at the very most. Like this should not be a starter for you. He should not be playing starter snaps. He needs to go back into that situational role where preferably him coming downhill and then I'm playing special teams. But in reality, Shane, I think that his job is probably more secure than Bush's job with the Steelers and with Jack's job with the Steelers because of financial reasons. You should be able to get Spillane back for a very reasonable deal. He's an older guy at this point. He's not an athlete. People might value his special teams ability. I can see that, but not enough to throw like starter money at him or anything that way. So I think that there's a good chance he comes back. And considering the depth, how poor the depth is at the linebacker position, or projected to be, at least for the Steelers, I would say that he comes back to Pittsburgh for his age 27 season here. Let's go to Malik Reed. I was not thrilled with what I saw from Malik Reed since doing that trade. They executed a trade just before the deadline with the Denver Broncos. But what do you think his future holds?
I don't know if he has much of a future, but he definitely doesn't have one with Pittsburgh. I assume he was just downright horrific for most of the snaps he played. Again, and it's weird because you look at the production he had with Denver, and maybe that is just, Fangio and other guys, the defensive coordinators, able to find ways to make him valuable in some sense of the word, but he is not an edge rusher by any means at this point. Like, I don't even view him as that. He's almost like he's basically a blitzer. Is probably the only thing he might be able to do okay at linebacker. Off the edge, you just can't ask a guy to be that type of player and play edge rusher for you. So I don't know if he'll sign with with another team as a true edge rusher or not, but I don't see him playing for the Steelers at all for sure next year.
Yeah, I'm with you. I was certainly not pleased by what I saw in that first half of the season when TJ Watt played less than one full game. The Steelers were on track to be like the 4th worst sack team on record since that became a stat, because Malik Reed was just so bad at getting pressure on the football. Like I said before, it seemed like we were playing with 10 guys out there at times. Like, he was so easy to take out of the game with just a single block or even a tight end at times that he just didn't offer anything. The guy doesn't play special teams. He's halfway through his NFL career, if not more so. He's had some production in the past with the Broncos, but I just don't care about that at this point. What matters is your sample this past season with the Steelers, and it was not a good one. Like, I think that the Steelers had gotten way more in the past out of guys like Anthony Chickillo and backups who have been thrust into roles like that than they did out of Malik Reed. And so I see no reason for him to come back. Even though he's in the prime of his career, he shouldn't get any money. I just don't. Honestly, Shane, I don't think I would pay him the veteran minimum to come back, because
not for the Steelers.
If you can't play special teams, and I don't want to see you on the field ever, there's no reason to take up a roster spot in my mind. And so, so maybe that third edge job, that maybe they draft a guy for that. Maybe they go out and get someone better in free agency, and then the fourth edge, I'm fine with a guy like Jameer Jones if you need to, or someone at that level who is basically just there to play special teams and maybe step up into a few snaps in the event of an injury. I'd love for Steelers to have like 2 full rotations of edge defenders, like a lot of teams do, a lot of good teams do. Like Dallas is one of them. The 49ers. The Eagles, they've got 2 full rotations of edge defenders. They can keep these guys fresh all the time so that they're able to tee off on the quarterback. Like, they need that guy. They need that Melvin Ingram guy that they had, that they kind of ran out of town. They mutually ran each other apart from each other. But Highsmith and Watt, they're playing too many snaps in my mind, and you just don't want these guys to wear down. And even if they stay healthy all season, they're going to have a ton of snaps under them by the time the Steelers get into the playoffs, assuming that they do. And you just need them to be fresher by that point late in the season. So they need that guy. It's not Malik Reed. I think we can both agree on that. So let's talk about Chris Wormley, a name that we were talking about here a little bit ago. Steelers defensive line depth, not great, but Wormley coming off an ACL tear. What can you do?
I think he'll be back in camp at some point. I think they'll bring him back to just after the injury, just because I don't know if another team will offer him before the Steelers would, and they're going to have more details about his injury. They're going to have more information on his recovery than anyone else will. It makes sense that he's like a late camp addition, or just maybe they bring him back with the assumption that if he gets healthy, he'll probably make the team as one of the defensive linemen. If he doesn't, then he'll be gone. That's what I expect. And just because, again, he's not going to get any money from a team not coming off an ACL, pretty straightforward to me. I think this is pretty simple for the Steelers, just to bring him back on a provisional basis until you see what he looks like.
Okay. I don't see this one as quite so cut and dry, Shane. And the reason is because it depends on where the Steelers, which direction they want to go from here. If they sign a defensive lineman or two in free agency, or let's say they sign one interior defender, they draft one. At that point, Wormley's about halfway through his rehab process from that ACL. Do you need to go back to him? I know he's been good for you in the past, but where does that roster spot coming from if you've already made preemptive moves to fill those holes? If an Ogunjobi comes back and if they draft a guy in the second round with one of their second round picks or a third round pick, and then you got DeMarvin Leal. And so I'm just trying to see where he fits in. And I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think this one is really more though of a coin flip, and it just depends on the upcoming moves that the Steelers will have to make prior to knowing the health status of Chris Wormley. But I do agree with you in terms of he's just not going to have a big market. Not until after the season already is underway. And then maybe he signs with somebody else. If they go down with an injury, maybe he jumps on a different squad. But I think that he could come back with the Steelers. But the question to me is, do you bring Wormley back as a camp body type guy if you already think that you filled those needs by then and have those starters in place? And would he be willing to do that? I don't know. I think that one's a little bit more up in the air. Yeah. I will agree with you though. I'll say that because I think mostly because of lack of market for him, I think that he will be back at some point.
Even if it's only for camp or like getting a chance to see what he looks like, mostly because even if you do all the moves that you mentioned, and that's definitely possible that they address defensive line pretty hard because of the lack of depth right now, especially if they let Ogunjobi go and everything else. But I'd be surprised if he isn't in camp with us at some point. It just comes down to, does he make the team because of the depth we had? Or is it a situation where he's just not healthy, whatever the case may be? Then you might see him be let go and someone else pick him up later in the season when he's maybe closer to being 100%.
Yeah. And very interestingly, like the Steelers have had, I thought that their defensive line was deep. Like I've said the last couple of years,
we thought
especially when they had, when they had to it for sure. And over the last several years, they've let guys go who have done well with other teams, like Isaiah Buggs this year.
For the Lions.
Like
really good.
He played well, and he played like 77% of the snaps. Henry Mondeau played 28% of the snaps with the Giants. And so these guys, these like bottom of the roster interior defenders that the Steelers have had to release, they've gone on and made an impact with other teams. So I think that Wormley could be down in that range, like it's going into his age 30 season with the injury that he's coming off of. And depending on what the Steelers do in free agency in the draft, he could be teetering on that edge of, do we keep him? Do we re-sign him? So I think that he's kind of down at that level at this point, but we'll see what they do. I think that if I had to guess, I'd probably say he's coming back. DeMonte KZ, this one, I was thrilled with what we got out of him. It makes me disappointed that he had to start the season on IR, because I think that he could have been just that extra player that they kind of needed all along, that dime package player, versatile guy, ball skills. He is going to be 30 years old. I don't know how big the market's going to be for him this year, but what do you think about KZ coming back?
I think if you can get him back cheaper, similar to what you paid for him this year, despite the fact he didn't get to play a lot of the year, I would definitely want to see that happen. I think he's a really nice third safety to have for this team, especially because if Fitzpatrick goes down at any point or has to miss time, he can play deep safety still. I think even at 30 years old, he's best, I think, definitely as the third safety at this point, just because he does have the versatility to do a few different things. and you can have, Edmonds maybe play closer to the Bucks and have KZ out there as more of a cover defender. There's just a lot of things you can do with those three guys, right? And I think that's why, and I mentioned earlier, I really want to see this trio come back and see what we can do defensively with them. Because I do think the best version of this defense, granted, Watt was back and everyone else too, but the best version of the secondary especially was when all three of them were back there together for sure. And I want to see if that can continue next year as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I do think that there might be a few teams out there who maybe think that KZ would be a stopgap starter for them. But after missing the first half of the year on IR, being a 30-year-old player, I think they're probably more likely to go in a different direction, maybe sign a more long-term option. I like KZ. I like him a lot, but I agree with you. I like him in that backup role where he can kind of do a little bit of everything for the Steelers. You don't have to pigeonhole him into being a full-time starter. And that's why I want to see all three of those guys return. Obviously, Minka is locked up. He's not going anywhere. But Edmonds and KZ, both free agents. The Steelers bring back one. Do they bring back both? I want both of them to come back. I think that the money is going to be reasonable enough to do that. And you keep the back end of your secondary strong by doing that too. Like if they only brought back one, and if somebody were to go down with injury, I'd feel a lot more comfortable about KZ coming in than someone like Miles Killebrew or a guy that's there as the fourth safety to play special teams. So I definitely want to see him come back this year. And I think the Steelers will find a way to get that done. I think that the money is going to be well within reason there. Trenton Scott. We talked about him a little bit already. Now the Steelers don't keep Jesse Davis, which we said they won't. Do they keep Trent Scott, or is he just a camp body who's going to get beat out by a different offensive tackle?
I would like him to be beat out by somebody, but he is a Pat Meyer guy. There's a reason he was on this team this year, and I think that was a big part of it. Now, granted, everybody seemed to pick up for the most part, at least compared to in the preseason, early part of the season, kind of pick up on what he wants them to do. So maybe his value as kind of maybe a guy who can teach those guys isn't going to be as high. So that might lead to him not really having a spot, but I don't really. It's not really a big concern of mine if he's on the team. If he's the 7th or 8th lineman, that's not going to kill you. And I don't think he's so bad that he shouldn't be on the team at all. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he sticks around in that role just because of the relationship with Meyer.
Yeah, I think being like the most seasoned player on that team, the eldest of that group, and the fact that there's just no reason to bring Jesse Davis back when you are already playing Trent Scott over him. I think that Scott probably does return as maybe that last offensive tackle on the roster, but I do believe the Steelers will make a proactive move this year to go out and get an offensive tackle, certainly at some point, probably in the NFL draft. And so I think that he makes it. Whether or not he'll be a guy that's game day active, I don't know. At that point, he might be starting off depending on where the Steelers draft the tackle. If it's not until the end of day 2 or day 3, then he'll be game day active. But I'll say that he'll make it because I don't see probably them moving on from their 2 most veteran players in the same year in Jesse Davis and Trent Scott. I think Scott's the one that makes it over Davis. Carl Joseph. I don't know what do you think would have happened to him had he not landed on IR during the preseason? Would he have made the roster anyway?
I think so. I mean, I think you would have at least seen him make the team to start the year and kind of, especially because KZ went out too. Like, it's hard with him because there was a point early in his career when he was coming out, obviously as a first round pick, like a lot of athleticism, big playmaker guy. Didn't really show that much in the NFL early on and really ever, but he is a guy that has played a lot, and I think that does have some value from that perspective. I think it just kind of comes down to what he looks like in camp. I think they'll offer him a job to come into camp at least. I don't think other teams will be super interested in him, honestly, because he didn't get to play last year, really. So it might come down to, does he make the 53 after being invited to camp? But I don't think he's going to get a true contract that you expect him to make the team on, at least.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you there. And I just don't know if there's room for Joseph and Casey. I think that those guys, they play that same role where they can play either safety spot in a pinch. They can play in the box if needed. And I don't think that either of them are special teams players at this point in their career. You're going to rely on somebody else as that fourth safety to do that job. So you bring back one of the two. KZ is obviously more trustworthy at this point. He had the 7 interception season in the past. He played well for the Steelers this year when he came in. And so I think that unless the finances are way off one way or the other, I think that I would definitely have to give that job to KZ unless he ends up signing a decent sized deal somewhere else, then they can go with Joseph. But I'm going to say that Joseph is gone. Miles Boykin, Steelers receiver this year. Another one that kind of comes down to an interesting situation. We talked about the receiving corps a lot prior to the roster cuts. But then Anthony Miller ends up landing on IR, who had a really strong summer in training camp. Miller was just recently signed back to the Steelers for this coming season. Do you think that Miles Boykin makes the team as maybe that special teams last receiver on the roster type guy?
I do, and it's because he is a excellent special teamer, one of the best gunners in the sport, really good special teamer overall. Like that's what his role is, and I think it's totally fine to have that as the last receiver. I think it's very important to keep a player like him because we really don't have a lot of elite special teams players on this team.
Mm,
Was one last year. I'd be very surprised if just for that reason, because he's a guy that I think Tomlin definitely likes and enjoyed having on the team. I still wish they would have in those run packages, and maybe if he comes back, they will hopefully do this. Let him run down the field. He can do that. Like he
yeah.
can run down the field and catch some deep passes. Like do some play action stuff out of that grouping that he was always on when we were running the football. We never saw it. I don't really still understand why, but this is Canada, so I guess I can't really say anything about that. But even if it's just that, and even that's the only chance he has to bring anything on offense, I'm totally fine with that when you get the special team play you get out of him. So
Yeah, throw a curveball in there. My
yeah,
goodness. Like
something.
we knew every time that Miles Boykin or Gunnar Olszewski were on the field, they were going to run the football. They just didn't fool anybody. And so, yeah, I would like to see them. I would have liked to see them do something out of there. Now, where this becomes interesting, Shane, is Calvin Austin's going to be coming off an IR. He's expected to be fully healthy next season. And
Yeah,
I would also fully expect the Steelers to draft a wide receiver, maybe as
I do
early as
too.
day 2.
I do
And
too.
so when you factor in those things, plus the return of Anthony Miller, if Miller cracks the roster, boy, there's at least 2 receivers that are odd men out this time. I think that either Olszewski or Sims will be one of them. I think that that's a little bit of redundancy there. They probably don't need both of those guys. Olszewski is better on special teams. Sims probably a little bit better as a slot receiver. But then I agree with you still, though. I'm going to agree with you still because Boykin is just so good in the role that he is, that special
Yes.
teams coverage unit gunner. I think they have to bring him back and you have to cut elsewhere. And if that means maybe keeping an extra receiver on the roster, maybe you do that. But yeah, I'm going to say that Boykin comes back as well, just because he is so good in that role. Jameer Jones, he is an exclusive rights free agent. And so the Steelers can throw less than $1 million at him and get him back. Is it worth them doing that this year?
He already has some experience with us. I see there's no reason why you wouldn't.
Mhm.
Even if he doesn't end up making the roster, ultimately, I think it makes sense to at least use that right as an exclusive
Yeah.
rights free agent. Maybe they decide to go after somebody else at the bottom end of the roster to play edge, but I'm fine with him as the fourth guy as long as they bring in someone who's an actual third edge rusher, especially.
Yeah.
I think he has a chance to make it just as that fourth edge guy.
Yeah, like we said, that 4th spot is you're primarily just a special teams player, except in the event of injuries, you might have to see a few more snaps on defense. At the price, I mean, there's very little risk involved there. So I can definitely see him bringing back Jameer Jones. I would prefer to. I thought we were getting an upgrade when the Steelers looked at Ola Adeni when he was released by the Titans, but the physical fell through. That would be better because at least he gives you something on the defensive side of the ball. But I would say the Steelers probably go and bring back Jameer Jones. He was good enough on special teams. Won't ask a lot of him on defense, but they kind of need that role anyway. At least that's to take a helmet for now until they find maybe some better options down the line. Benny Snell, unrestricted free agent this year, looked pretty good this season compared to the past, at least when called upon, was pretty efficient for the Steelers. Didn't run the ball a lot, though, because when Jaylen Warren became healthy again, it was that 1-2 punch with Najee and Warren that they were using. So Snell went back to being a special teams guy. He is a Tomlin guy, though. Like we've said this in the past, we thought there was a chance that he wouldn't stick around. Tomlin loves that special teams ability that he offers. So what do you think?
I have to assume he'll be back, and honestly, because we have a true number 2 running back now, I don't care as much if he makes the team because it is going to
Mhm.
be a special teams role
Yeah.
primarily anyway. I think McFarland deserves a look again as well. He played well whenever he was asked to for us this year, which that's the problem with it is I think that Snell obviously has a leg up because he is a true special teams player, and that
Yep.
makes him more valuable as a third running back. But I think he's not as good of a running back as some of the other guys we've had in that third spot or had potential to have in the third spot. But it's hard for me to assume he won't be back because other teams aren't going to value him any more than the Steelers are, anything as far as a runner goes. And he's already been here. I think he likes being here. It'd be surprising if he's not back to play special teams mostly.
Yeah, his value strictly comes on special teams at this point in his career, and I don't think there's any reason to expect that he's going to have a big market for a running back who is on his second. He's going to be on his second contract now, and a guy that ran basically a 4.6 to begin with, and so he's not going to be one that's carving out a role in offense for anybody else. I think what hurt Anthony McFarland was exactly what you said: the fact that Snell did play special teams, and if they hadn't signed Warren last year, I think McFarland ends up probably being an active player who's second on the team in carries, not a practice squad running back. And so he kind of drew the short straw there. He had his opportunity and kind of fell out of favor. I do think that Snell comes back. Tomlin likes special teams. Danny Smith likes him. And so I think that's a guy they bring back next year. Probably play that running back 3, get one of those last helmets on game day. We're going to go through these last few pretty quickly here. And then we will cover just a few minutes of the playoffs. We're going to do some predictions. We'll whiz through. J.C. Hassenauer, restricted free agent. Do the Steelers bring him back as the backup center?
I think it's fine if they do. As backup centers, it's kind of a position where if you have anyone who has some experience with your team, at least, it's kind of more valuable than having a true better athlete or better player, especially because Cole, even when he was banged up, still played. He was still able to do that. As long as Cole's back, I think, especially, which I'm sure they're not going to move off of him at this point. It would be surprising if they don't just kind of keep things going with Hassenauer as the backup center, I think.
Yeah, I would say the only way that they wouldn't would be if the Steelers target a center in the NFL draft. I'm not convinced that they will, because they did play Cole pretty good money, and Cole was solid this year. I think that Hassenauer comes back as the backup. James Pierre, also a restricted free agent, which means the Steelers can get him back without a bidding war. And I think that he's coming back, Shane. I think that he offers that depth as that bottom of the roster type guy. Zach Gentry is unrestricted this year. Is the Steelers' number 2 tight end? That one's a little more interesting.
I think it's likely he will, just because he hasn't done anything to say that he shouldn't be a tight end on this team. I just hope they use him less as far as the screen game and stuff like that. But I think he's fine as a number 2 tight end. He's not going to command any money, so I'd be surprised if they don't bring him back on a small deal. So.
I agree. I mean, again, Tomlin is a player's coach. Appease your guys. Hit him and Freiermuth are close. He fits that role perfectly, that Y role that he can do everything that Freiermuth doesn't do. As the true inline blocker type guy, I think Gentry comes back. And the last of the 22 names on the list is Elijah Riley, the safety, and he is a exclusive rights free agent. I don't know about that one, and that's just he's
another guy that he'll probably be back because he's an exclusive rights free agent, but then he probably won't make the team, so it doesn't really matter too much. But
yeah,
he'll be around and then probably just not be here is the most likely outcome there.
Yep, and when they have their secondaries back to full health, they don't have those season-ending injuries. I can't see him sticking around unless he's really impressive in training camp. Right. All right, that's all of those. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Still Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Still Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all your support. All right, Shane, we're running a little bit behind here, but we're going to do our playoff predictions really quick just so we have these on record. And I want to see.
We always want to have it on record, right? We always need to know, hey, let's
exactly
out there.
Yes, we want to show our expertise here, and once we get all these games wrong. So
sure. Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about this real quick. Remaining teams all have something in common, and Shane, that is, I think they all are offensive minded. They all are led by offensive minded head coaches. That is obviously something the Steelers do not have. How much importance would you place on that? Is it just a coincidence that all 8 remaining teams have offensive minded head coaches, or is that the way that the NFL is moving?
So I think 2 things. One, you do have to give a shout out to Sean McDermott with the Bills because he is a defensive guy, but the Bills have an all-world quarterback, at least whenever he is playing. He has his moments sometimes with Josh Allen, but I think the key thing here that people need to understand is that having an offensive-minded coach gives you I think it gives you a leg up, but it does matter who they have as their defensive coordinators, right? We've seen offensive-minded coaches fail. We've seen defensive-minded coaches fail. The problem is I think it's much easier to bring in a guy who is a proven offensive mind and who can bring in a defensive mind to handle his defense than it is to bring in a really defensive-minded coach and hope that he can bring in an offensive coordinator that can do everything offensively. I think it's much harder to find that offensive coordinator that isn't already getting looks as a head coach or already getting looks in certain situations where they may not be around very long. And it's harder to keep those offensive-minded guys who are good on your team. the Lions were dealing with that. Luckily, Ben Johnson decided he was going to stay. Luckily for them, but once you have a really good offensive mind on your team as a coach, it's likely he's getting poached by another team
Yeah.
not long after. So that's, I think, the problem with a lot of teams who go with the defensive minded coaches is they just can't find consistency of offensive coordinator, and unfortunately, we fall into that category right now.
Yeah. And I forgot about McDermott there for a second, but let's talk about someone who just got poached was Brian Daboll last year of the New York Giants. And look where the Giants are now, 1 year later, one of the biggest turnarounds in the NFL. I think having that offensive game plan is so important when you get an innovative guy like Daboll, like most of the guys are right now remaining in the playoffs. And so I think that that's something that, again, even if Steelers find that guy, let's say they find the next Mike McDaniel or whoever that is, that player is going to get poached from them in a very short amount of time because those offensive minds are so coveted in the NFL. That's the way there's going. There's very few of the Tomlin guys left out there, the Bill Belichick's, who are the defensive-minded coaches, and the ones that are typically are either retreads or they don't keep their jobs very long outside of a select few. And so I think that is the way, unfortunately, the NFL is going. It's not the way the Steelers are built. I'm hoping that it doesn't matter. I'm hoping they can still win a championship anyway. We'll save that. We'll table that for a later date here. But let's go ahead and make our divisional round playoff predictions here. First up on the list, we got the Jaguars at the Chiefs. Who wins this game, Shane?
I love what the Jaguars have done this year, and I love the comeback as much as it pains me for Justin Herbert. I think that he was let down by his team. I will say that. The Chiefs are just better, right? They're at home.
Yeah.
They're better. I have a hard time thinking that Trevor Lawrence, despite his kind of Jekyll and Hyde performance last week, I don't think he's going to be able to do enough against that Chiefs defense, even though it's not super strong. I think that there's just too much to overcome with Kansas City.
Yep, I would agree with you there. I mean, the Jaguars, they were one of the hottest teams down the stretch there.
Yeah.
This past month in December, I believe they put up 40 points against the Dallas Cowboys in a win against them. And so definitely Trevor Lawrence is coming into form here. Their offense is looking pretty good, especially in that second half of that Chargers game. What an epic game that one was. That was, I mean, but I'm going to go with the Chiefs here. You cannot go against Patrick Mahomes. I mean, that's just... he's making it to at least the championship game. We'll see what happens after that, but I'm definitely going Chiefs over Jags. All right, let's go to the NFC. Eagles and Giants. Giants playing at Philadelphia. Who's winning this one?
I'm still giving the even though the Giants really impressed me against the Vikings, and I did predict the Vikings to lose that game in the show I do for another NFL thing. I just feel like the Eagles, with Hurts healthy now, I think they're just a better team in general. I think the Giants' magical run does come to an end here, but kudos to them. One of the big stories of the year, really fun year for them and Daboll. I think they have a really bright future, but I do think the Eagles make it at least to the NFC title game, and we'll go on from there.
Yep, an incredibly bright future, I think, for the Giants. And what they were able to do, the strides that Daniel Jones made in doing so without any wide receivers, I think Daboll deserves a ton of credit for that. But I agree. I think that Philly is just too strong, just too deep. They get their quarterback back. I've got the Eagles advancing to the NFC Championship game. Bengals at Bills.
This one's very, very tough because the way the Bills played this past week, Josh Allen was just he was real loose with the ball, right? And that's something he's been in the past.
Yeah.
It does concern you a little bit. I think that if he plays like he did last week, this week, they lose. I do think they lose. But I still feel like the Bills overall are the stronger team. I think that they're the healthier team a little bit as well. I know the Bengals are dealing with a lot of offensive line issues right now and things like that, which that might be kind of their Achilles heel. I know they were able to get past it last year in their Super Bowl run, but I still give the edge to the Bills, but only slightly, and it's because they are going to be at home despite the whole weird schedule situation with DeMar Hamlin situation, everything like that. I think that it's not going to be surprising to me if the Bengals do pull it off by any means, but I think that the Bills will be able to squeak it out at the end.
Yeah, this one's interesting. I think that it probably will end up being a close contest. I can see the Bengals, though, even losing if Joe Burrow still has a better game than Josh Allen, just because that Bills team is strong. Defense is pretty strong. Bengals have no offensive tackles. And so I think that's going to hurt them a lot. I do think that the Bills emerge victorious. Josh Allen has not been the same in the second half of the season that he was in the first, but we still know what Josh Allen is capable of. And if he has one of those games, it's lights out, like for anybody pretty much. So I'm going Bills over Bengals. Last one, Cowboys versus 49ers, San Francisco hosting that game.
I think the Cowboys are going to be riding high off of their dismantling of the Buccaneers and what maybe, probably not just because it's him, but it could have been Tom Brady's last game. But this 49ers team, I know that Brock Purdy is mostly probably fool's gold. I understand that he's played very well within the system, but he isn't a guy that I expect to see much of after this year, maybe next. I just don't think the train ends here. I think that they go on to the NFC title game. I think the Cowboys are going to mess something up, even if they have the chance to win. Mike McCarthy, if it's in a close game, I'm always going to take the team that Mike McCarthy isn't coaching. That's just kind of how I am with him, for better or for worse. But I'll take the Niners for sure in this situation.
Yeah, I go back and forth with this one. My gut tells me that the 49ers are the better team, and they're more well-rounded. They can bully you in the trenches. And Cowboys they're respectable as well, obviously. I'm going to go with the 49ers just because I think that they've been so dominant. They've won 11 games in a row, and they easily handled the Seahawks. And the Cowboys, although they had a great game, I think the Bucs are kind of a trash team who didn't deserve to be in there. And Tom Brady had one of the worst quarterback performances I've seen in the playoffs in a long time. And so I think that it's going to be kind of a wake-up call for them. They're going to take a massive jump from maybe the worst team in the playoffs to maybe the best team in the playoffs. And I think that Shanahan is just going to be able to outcoach. I agree with you there. They're going to get guys running wide open, and they're going to have some big plays. And so unless Dak plays, like I think he played maybe arguably the best game he's played ever this past game in the playoffs.
Yeah.
But this is a big step up still. So I'm going to go 49ers in a close game in that one. All right, Shane. So let's do our Super Bowl predictions. We'll see if either of us are right in a few weeks here. Who have AFC versus NFC, which two teams, and who ultimately wins?
I think that based on our picks for the divisional round, I think that the Chiefs ultimately come out of the AFC. I still trust them more at the end of the day. And maybe I'm wrong. I think any of the teams that could meet them in the title game could potentially beat them for sure. We already seen both teams beat them in the regular season, but it's different monster when you get Mahomes in the playoffs. He's just been very hard to beat. The Bengals did it last year. I don't know if I can really expect them to do it again. Maybe they can, and that'd be 4 straight wins against them, which is insane when you think about how well the Chiefs have played past 5 years. But I still give it the edge to the Chiefs to make it out. And then I want to, just because the story would be very fun. I would love to see the rematch against the Niners. After a couple of years of both these teams kind of going in different directions a little bit, but my heart still tells me the Eagles make it to the Super Bowl. And ultimately, though, unfortunately for our fellow friends across the way in Philadelphia, I do think the Chiefs ultimately beat them in the Super Bowl.
Okay, so you got Chiefs over Eagles.
Yes, I do.
I'm going to go a little bit of different direction. I do think the Chiefs make it there as well. I think that they are the most consistent of all the AFC teams. I think that Patrick Mahomes is the single best player in football, and he's been here before. He's been on the stage, 50 touchdown season, league MVP, Super Bowl MVP, and so this is nothing new to him. I think he can get back there and he can do it again. For the NFC, I've got the 49ers making it in over the Eagles. I think they're just so hot right now. And I wasn't thrilled with the Eagles defense down the stretch, even though I trust their offense is still going to be good. I think that the 49ers Shanahan finally gets into that position right there. But I have I'm sorry. I do have the 49ers. I have the 49ers topping the Chiefs.
Ooh,
so that's what I meant to say.
Okay.
I've got the 49ers and Shanahan getting that first Super Bowl win that he's been close to in the past, especially as offensive coordinator back in Atlanta, finally gets that Super Bowl title. And I think that once the 49ers and Chiefs play each other, it's just going to be too overwhelming for Patrick Mahomes alone, basically, to overcome that talent gap. That the 49ers are just so well-rounded. So I've got 49ers over Chiefs. Shane, what did you say you have?
I have Chiefs over Eagles.
Chiefs over Eagles. Okay. We'll see who's right. I'm interested to see how this plays out. Maybe neither of us.
It'd be very fun if the Niners can win the Super Bowl with Brock Purdy, presumably being the quarterback, and what that means for them in the future too. So that'd be very fun though, either way.
Yeah, that would be definitely kind of like a Cinderella story there. You don't see quarterbacks like that winning the Super Bowl often. All right. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us today on the show. You can follow Shane on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and also check us out on YouTube. Thanks for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.